I did look at the the so-called drones that ended up in Poland. Only one struck anything, and none of them were armed. They seem to have been picked up and through electronic warfare redirected in some way. The Belarusians tracked these drones coming out of northeastern Ukraine or out of northwestern Ukraine, headed west. They informed the Polish authorities that these were coming. They actually shot some down, and the Polish authorities then subsequently attacked them or sent up aircraft trying to deal with them. They seem to have actually shot down 20%. But the wreckage that's being examined, there were no explosives. So there was no intention to harm anybody. And it looks like these were simply caught up in this massive electronic warfare environment. I mean, most people don't understand that today in Ukraine, White Russia, Poland, Lithuania, all these areas, there's enormous electronic warfare underway, where people are not only trying to track things, but also defeat intrusions. So bottom line is NATO has said, no, we don't regard this as an attack at all. So then the next question comes, why are there 40,000 troops on the Polish border facing Belarus? Because that's what I'm told has gone there. And I got into contact with some of my reliable Polish sources, and they confirmed to me universally, said, this is theater. This is the Polish government trying to play up something that is otherwise meaningless. And it plays to a certain audience in Poland that is still paranoid about Russia. And it's an attempt also to strengthen in some people's minds Poland's connection to NATO. And you can roll all of those things together. But the truth is, there's no Russian threat to Poland. There's no Russian intention to attack Poland. This was not an attack on Poland, as NATO has already stated publicly. So I think we can bury this. It's dead.
Before we bury it, we agree on everything so far. There's only one thing I want to question, is the intention behind the drones. So I don't think Russia intended to attack Poland. I remember when I was sleeping, my team woke me up saying Poland's under attack. It reminded me of the G20 during G20, when there was a Ukrainian drone, I think, or anti-defense missile that landed in Poland. Yeah. Everyone was up in arms. Yeah, exactly. It reminded me of that day. There's been a few incursions since. Pretty, it's expected during the war. But the only question I have has been reports. First, a lot of analysts are saying this was intentional, not to attack Poland, but to test either NATO's resolve for political theater, political posturing, or to test the air defense system in Poland, which didn't do too well. And there's also reports that came out, I'm not sure if you've seen these, that the drones, which were decoy drones, as you said, that had an additional fuel tank, which wouldn't be needed if they were targeting Ukraine. I'm not an expert. Is it a possibility that that was not to attack Poland, but to test NATO's resolve or NATO's capabilities or the speed of response?
I'm skeptical of that argument. I'm much more prepared to believe that the Ukrainians misdirected these drones in order to create the illusion of a Russian assault on Poland. That I could believe much more readily than what you just described. As for the additional fuel tanks, I'm unfamiliar with that. Again, I haven't seen the wreckage. This is the first I've heard of it. Again, I'm skeptical of that sort of thing. Sounds like someone's reaching. The business of testing NATO resolve. My question is, what NATO resolve? Who are we kidding? I don't see any evidence that there are any NATO armies mobilizing and moving east. Right now, the French military is waiting to be called into duty inside France against people inside France that threaten the government. I think something similar could happen in Great Britain. And in Germany, they seem to be rounding up everyone who is a quote-unquote nationalist who's in uniform and imprisoning them. I don't see much evidence for NATO resolve. So I think there's no reason to test it because it doesn't exist. I don't think Moscow is in the least worried about anybody in Western Europe militarily at this point. And on the other hand, I think it's been made pretty clear by President Trump, even though he continues to say he's going to send more equipment and aid to Ukraine, that he's largely disinterested in becoming involved there and is turning his attention elsewhere.
Colonel, I want to ask you a broader question. It just came to my mind now. We've talked a lot about nuanced discussions about Ukraine war, what's happening in Gaza, Hezbollah. Our first discussion was prior to the war in Hezbollah when we met I think it was in Washington. What's your stance on America's military capabilities? We saw the drills, not the drills, the military parade in China surprised a lot of analysts in terms of their capabilities. So maybe a more direct question would be, where do you place the US now in terms of military might, and how would you compare it to China and also Russia?
Well, we know that we can sink unarmed, fast speedboats in the open that are otherwise undefended. We've done that in the Caribbean. That's the latest naval victory for the U.S. Navy. Look, I think the United States Armed Forces right now are still, for the most part, what I would call legacy forces. In other words, these forces collectively are a tribute to the Second World War and the Cold War. We're still operating within a strategic framework that is really increasingly irrelevant. What we've done is we've taken some new technologies from time to time, new capabilities, repackaged them inside the existing force structure. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's nothing really new in the U.S. Armed Forces over the last 20 or 30 years that we can point to as evidence for fundamental change in any new direction. These are old force structures, old force designs. Now, when we turn to China, we're seeing evidence for some new force designs. They're now talking about battle groups composed of different kinds of forces. Remember, they've got an estimated 15 to 18 divisions of pure infantry that guard their borders. And they have borders that are thousands of miles long, so that makes sense. But they have no military capability. So if you take that out of the equation, look at the rest of it, you do have now submarines, nuclear submarines that are armed ostensibly with nuclear weapons. And I think the Chinese are developing rapidly in that area. But I think the most important things that we saw were once again in what we would call the rocket forces. And China's emphasis in military development and force design, almost from the beginning, has been to provide forces capabilities that will stop us, the United States Navy, principally and Air Force, from intervening in China. In other words, this is what we refer to as anti-interventionist capabilities or area denial capabilities, denial in the event that we wanted to penetrate Chinese airspace, denial to us in the event that we wanted to assemble a task force off the shores of China and try to invade it. These are the things that we saw. Otherwise, we saw lots of properly uniformed, good-looking young men and women who miraculously marched in step, which is more than I can say for the U.S. Army right now, based upon their last parade on the 14th of June. So I would say we are a glimpse of the past. What you saw in Beijing is a glimpse of the future.
How's that? First, that's concerning. But second, how's that possible when China's spending so much less, reportedly, obviously we don't know the exact figures, on their military development? Are you saying the U.S. Army is just too inefficient? Or am I misunderstanding you? Because you're saying the U.S. Army hasn't developed anything new, but is still far ahead of China, which doesn't have a lot of, they haven't been tested really during times of war. So that's an advantage that the US have because they're over-testing their equipment, to be honest.
Well, if you go back to 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, everyone in the Western world was convinced that the British and French forces, particularly their armies, were vastly superior to the Germans because they had all this wonderful military experience, all of which turned out to be completely irrelevant in the war with Germany. And the German forces during the First World War, I would argue even in the Second, were always superior to the Western forces they confronted and to the Eastern forces. Particularly in World War I, if you go back and look at the statistics, for every German casualty, there were at least 2 to 3 casualties in the French and British armies, even though the French and British armies outnumbered them. I guess what I'm saying is we tend to overrate recent experience against weak opponents as evidence for superiority. That tells you absolutely nothing. Secondly, you got to look at the way forces are organized and how they're equipped. If we look at the rocket artillery, the capabilities that exist in both the Russian and Chinese forces, they vastly outstrip us. We have nothing to compare with it. I was looking at a very recent strike by the Russians in Ukraine on what was a very sensitive target because it contained all of the drone operators and all of the strategic direction being imparted to Ukrainian drones in a part of Ukraine. The Russians tracked it, they identified it, they caught all of the electronic signals, and then they used something that they call a flamethrower. The flamethrower is not really a flamethrower, it's another version of rocket artillery using thermobaric warheads. Thermobaric warheads means fuel, air, gas, explosive. Very powerful. And in the space of a few minutes, from various locations, several of these flamethrower systems attacked the site, and it was erased effectively from the earth. We don't have those systems in the U.S. Army, not even close. And our whole air and missile defense network is very weak. Have to remember that for the last 50 years, we've relied almost, I would say, almost exclusively on the United States Air Force to provide air and missile defense for the forces on the ground. And that's because we did not encounter enemy air forces that were very capable. I mean, the last time we had really to fight capable air forces was probably during the Korean War, when Russian pilots flew MiG aircraft against us. Prior to that, it was, of course, the Germans, and the Germans had very good air defenses for the time. That's changed now. In other words, technology has advanced, and in both the Russian and Chinese forces, I think you're going to see that in Iran as well. During the next round of war between Israel and Iran, I think you're going to see much better integrated air defenses there as a result of Russian assistance and technological advice. The point is, we're behind in those areas. NATO announced just, I think it was about 6 or 8 months ago, that with all of the air defense capability they have, they could protect perhaps 5% of NATO territory. How can you talk about going to war and you can only protect 5% of the territory that you're supposed to be defending? I mean, we are woefully behind in a number of really key areas. We're not even talking about standards of discipline, training, leadership, all of these things.